Chapter 3. Prerequisites for correct reading, thinking and imagination. Internal hindrances to good reading. Impatience. Laziness of thinking and imagination. Bad habits. The habit of leaving a book before you read it to the end. 1. Prerequisites for correct reading. 1. The presence of known abilities. 2. The absence of bad reading skills. The first and most necessary condition is the ability to focus and maintain attention on what is being read. Those who do not have it cannot read correctly. Of course, memory is also necessary in order to retain and understand what you have read. One often hears complaints about the weakening of memory. I read 2 or 3 lines or a small passage, move on to the next, but I have already forgotten the first. I don't even remember what it was about. There are often 2 reasons here. 2. Nervous illness, psychasthenia, neurasthenia, etc. In such cases, it is necessary, without delay, to consult a doctor. 3. Weakening of attention. We do not remember because we cannot properly focus our attention on what we read. Thought is constantly distracted from him. Sometimes you can notice that parallel to the vaguely conscious thoughts of the book, there are thoughts that have nothing in common with it. There are also mostly 2 reasons for this, either also an illness, or a bad habit. The struggle with a bad skill and, in part, with painful weakening and lack of attention, is reduced mainly to the exercise of attention, its intensified training. For example, they first take a passage of 2 or 3 lines and try to read it with full concentration of attention so that its thought becomes completely clear for the reader, transparently clear. To do this, sometimes you have to reread it several times in a row. When this is achieved with 2 or 3 lines, they begin to increase the number of lines every day. The exercise should be done every day. If the weakening of attention is not so strong, it is necessary, of course, to start with a longer passage. 2. Thinking and imagination. Of course, there is no need to pretend that a certain power of thinking is necessary for good reading. But most are not aware of the enormous importance of the power of the imagination. It is necessary to dwell on this issue for a bit longer. Imagination replaces for us to some extent our own experience. Our experience is very limited, even among those who have traveled a lot, have experienced a lot, have seen a lot. Imagination gives us the opportunity to see with someone else's eyes, often better than ours, that which we have not seen, to experience with people what we ourselves have not experienced. It's like a flying carpet. Learn to own it, and you will, at its will, be transported to any place, at any time. Whoever reads a trip, for example, in Africa, and knows how to correctly imagine, is traveling with the author. He sees, hears, feels, lives with him. Whoever reads a history book flies to the eternally living country of the past, lives the life of the ancients. He doesn't need Wells' time machine. To be able to imagine, to start up, where necessary, imagination with might and main means to infinitely expand your little experience, including the experience of mankind. This is the meaning of imagination. This is the power that few people know how to use properly. Many readers, especially young ones, use their imaginations, but only in order to about what they read dream about themselves. It's like a young reader, absorbing mind read or the like, imagines his own future exploits in the fight against wild beasts or bloodthirsty Apaches. At the same time, such unnecessary details as a description of the appearance, sometimes wonderful descriptions of nature, characteristics of everyday life, etc., are either completely omitted, or skimmed in passing. This is a completely incorrect reading. If only the reader would be aware of what he is depriving himself of by this. Of course, here too the main principle of correct reading should be strictly adhered to, the application of the method of reading to the goal. There are, for example, experiments that it is better for a person not to do, and there are books that are best read without straining your imagination. It will not only be useless, but also harmful, will poison our psyche. But those books that are chosen and read for the purpose of self-education should always be read with the full work of the imagination. 3. Internal hindrances to good reading. Impatience. These hindrances are either the psychic characteristics of the reader, like ordinary impatience, lazy thinking, lack of attention or imagination, etc., or bad habits. Impatience refers to the first of these. The reader does not have the patience to follow the development of thought, action, etc. He wants to know the result immediately. And so he skips whole pages, looks ahead, what is the end, etc. Sometimes this does no harm, but sometimes it spoils the whole reading of the book, it weakens interest. If running ahead is not caused by any special considerations, but only by impatience, this should be avoided. 4. Laziness of thinking and imagination. The most important obstacle in reading, which is more or less common for many readers, is laziness of thinking and laziness of imagination. We hate to strain them. We got, for example, in the book to the description. In order to vividly, in a coherent picture, to imagine what is depicted by the author, sometimes it takes effort. We are too lazy to make it, and the description disappears for us. Or we have before us an incomprehensible place in the book. It is necessary to concentrate all the forces of thought in order to understand it, or even sometimes just make only some effort for this. We don't want this effort, and we go further. The author proves something. We need to analyze his evidence. But this requires some tension of thinking, and so we slide further, rather, to where this effort is not required. It is not uncommon to read with the least effort, with the least strain of thought and imagination. And she is the greatest hindrance to reading. The person can be otherwise very hard-working, even in the area of reading and study. He reads, for example, huge tomes, patiently memorizes whole pages, but he is ready to memorize whole volumes, just not to strain his thinking. Passion for memorizing instead of learning correctly is very often explained by this very thing. And this is not entirely reduced to laziness of attention. Attention in other areas of activity works great. A person, for example, in the most attentive way, without errors, counts and rewrites huge columns of numbers, but as soon as it touches the effort of thinking and imagination, he gives up. It is with this greatest enemy of deep reading that any reader who strives to read well must fight. It is especially harmful for purposes such as self-education. The fight against him, like the fight against all laziness, primarily consists in the fact that we are fighting really, that is, we constantly remember that we must overcome laziness of attention and make every time to this effort. Here, too, nature is overcome by habit, and habit is created by a series of repeated actions. 5. Bad habits. These include primarily those that manifest themselves mainly in the weakening of attention. For example, the habit of thinking about something else while reading a book. For some, attention itself works fine, but a poor habit of careless reading spoils their work. This has already been mentioned above. The habit of just running through books, which leads to the inability to read slowly, is deadly. It can develop under the influence of many reasons. For example, the habit of swallowing books can lead to it. If you read 400 pages a day, of course, there can be no question of deep, full reading. Often the necessity teaches us to do the same. So, sometimes you have to reluctantly look through many books to familiarize yourself with them. This is the duty of the critic, the journalist. They sometimes find themselves in the position that M.U. Lermontov portrayed. Believe me, fate is not. We have been given heavy chains. Tell me, what is it like to read all this nonsense, all these books? And all why? To tell you that it is unnecessary to read them. But whatever the reason, it is necessary to fight its action, it is necessary to gradually maintain the skill for a full, in-depth reading of good, necessary, deep books, choosing the time for such reading. Reading voraciously. The habit of reading voraciously is also very harmful. When reading voraciously, a person can do without reading for a long time, but, having taken hold of it, he is already reading to the point of stupor, to headaches, to complete fatigue. How harmful it is, it goes without saying, but it is harmful in general to swallow books. It not only creates a bad habit of exceptional running through books and superficial reading, but directly affects memory, attention, and will in a weakening manner. I have often heard the complaints of swallowers about the weakening of memory. In general, when a lot is swallowed, little is digested. 6. The habit of throwing a book without having read to the end. Such a habit is harmful already because it weakens the will. One of the qualities of a strong person is to bring everything that you undertake to the end. But sometimes, of course, it is inevitably required to break this rule. If you have taken up a book in which you cannot understand anything, it will not be wise to overcome it without understanding anything. Usually, previewing books that are unfamiliar to us prevents the need to, having started reading in full, throw the book halfway. 19. Reading for self-education, with the right choice of books, does not allow such reading disorders. In a word, individual cases of deviations from the rule, do not throw books without finishing reading, are possible. But the habit of doing this is certainly harmful. And for some, it exists. Gaps in reading are likewise often inevitable and necessary, but only in those cases when they are justified by the purpose of reading. Incomplete reading becomes bad when omissions are not justified by a healthy goal or interfere with its implementation. Such is the habit of skipping indiscriminately all uninteresting places, descriptions, historical information and characteristics, reasoning in fiction, or the habit of reading in books of scientific content only what is interesting at the moment.